We're going to read chapter 9 of Island of the Blue Dolphins. Sadly, in the last chapter, Ramo was killed by the wild dogs, and so now we're going to see that Karana has to figure out how to live by herself on the island. I do not remember much of this time, except that many suns rose and set. I thought about what I was going to do now that I was alone. I did not leave the village. Not until I had eaten all of the abalones did I leave, and then only to gather more. Yet I do remember the day that I decided I would never live in the village again. It was a morning of thick fog and the sound of far-off waves breaking on the shore. I had never noticed before how silent the village was. Fog crept in and out of the empty huts. It made shapes as it drifted, and they reminded me of all the people who were dead and those who were gone. The noise of the surf seemed to be their voices speaking. So it kind of feels a little bit haunted, right? She's all by herself. She has all of these huts that everybody in the village lived in, probably dozens and dozens and dozens of huts, and it feels creepy there because there's nobody there and she's all by herself, and it probably makes her feel more alone than she's already even feeling. The noise of the surf seemed to be their voices speaking. I sat for a long time seeing these shapes and hearing the voices until the sun came out and the fog vanished. Then I made a fire against the wall of the house. When it was burned to the earth, I started a fire in another house. Thus, one by one, I destroyed them all so that there were only ashes left to mark the village of Galastat. There was nothing to take away with me except a basket of food. I therefore traveled fast, and before night fell, I reached the place where I had decided to live until the ship returned. This place lay on a headland, a half a league to the west of Coral Cove. There was a large rock on that headland and 2 stunted trees. Behind the rock was a clear place about 10 steps across, which was sheltered from the wind, from which I could see the harbor and the ocean. A spring of water flowed from a ravine nearby. So their island doesn't have any ponds or rivers or streams. It just has natural springs which gush water bubbles out of the springs, and that's where they get their drinking water. There are 2 springs on the island, and so the village, I'm guessing, was near one of the springs because you don't want to have water too far away. We're lucky we have water that you just turn on your sink and water comes out, drinking water comes out. But if you lived, if you were a native Californian and you lived in a village, they didn't have sinks with water that flowed. So you would have to take a basket and you would have to go get water, drinking water, and then you would have to carry it back without spilling it back to the village. And so most native Californians built their villages. That was their number one thing they looked for, was water supply, right? So I'm guessing the village was near one of the springs, one of the 2 springs on the island. Let's see. A spring of water flowed from a ravine nearby. That night I climbed onto the rock to sleep. It was flat on top and wide enough for me to stretch out. Also, it was so high from the ground that I did not need to fear the wild dogs while I was sleeping. I had not seen them again since the day they had killed Ramo, but I was sure they would soon come to my new camp. The rock was also a safe place to store the food I had brought with me and everything I should gather. Since it was still winter and any day the ship might return, there was no use to store food I would not need. This gave me the time to make weapons to protect myself from the dogs, which I felt would sometime attack me, to kill them all one by one. I had a club I found in one of the huts, but I needed a bow and arrows and a large spear. The spear which I had taken from the slain dog was too small. It was good for spearing fish and little else. The laws of Galastat forbade the making of weapons by women in the tribe, so I went out to search for any that might have been left behind. So when she burned down all of the huts in the village, she probably should have looked for weapons first before she probably should have combed through all the huts and taken things out of the huts that would have been helpful, like weapons, spears, arrowheads, because she doesn't know how to do any of that stuff. She's a woman, and women weren't allowed to make weapons. And so she doesn't know how to make weapons. So you're going to see burning down all the huts was kind of an impetuous thing for her to do. She is not an impetuous person, though. She's a thinker. She thinks through everything that she does. And so it's interesting to me that she was just caught in a moment of grief about her brother and burned the village down, right? She didn't really think too much. And now she's realizing, doggone it, I should have thought this through a little bit. The laws of Galestat forbade the making of weapons by women of the tribe, so I went out to search for any that might have been left behind. I went first to where the village had been and sifted the ashes for spearheads, and then finding none to the place where the canoes were hidden, believing that weapons might have been stored there with the food and water. I found nothing in the canoes under the cliff. Then, remembering the chest the Aleuts had brought to shore, I set out for Coral Cove. I had seen that chest on the beach during the battle, but did not remember that the hunters had taken it with them when they fled. The beach was empty except for rows of seaweed washed in by the storm. The tide was out, and I looked in the place where the chest had lain. It was just below the ledge Ulape and I had stood on while we watched the battle. The sand was smooth, and I dug many small holes with a stick. I dug in a wide circle, thinking that the storm might have covered it with sand. Near the center of the circle, the stick hit something hard, which I was sure was a rock. But as I dug deeper with my hands, I saw that it was the black lid of the chest. All morning I worked, moving the sand away. The chest lay deep from the washing of the waves, and I did not try to dig it out, but only so I could raise the lid. So remember, why does she want to look in the chest that the Aleuts left behind? She thinks there might be some iron spearheads in there. Remember, there were beads, glass beads, and some iron tools and spearheads. And so she's thinking, hey, I'm gonna, instead of me making my own weapons, maybe there are some here in this chest I can use. As the sun rose high, the tide came rushing up the beach and filled the hole with sand. Each wave covered the chest deeper until it was completely hidden. This shows how patient she is. It takes hours for the tide to come in, and the tide starts coming in while she's digging for the chest, and so she stands on top of the chest, and while the water comes in, the tide comes in and covers it, and she's probably covered, up to her waist in water, and she just stands there because she doesn't want to lose her place where she found the chest. Each wave covered the chest deeper until it was completely hidden. I stood on the place, bracing myself against the waves so that I would not have to look for it again. When the tide turned, I began to dig with my feet, working them down, and then with my hands. The chest was filled with beads and bracelets and earrings of many colors. I forgot about the spearheads I had come for. I held each of the trinkets to the sun, turning them so that they caught the light. I put on the longest string of beads, which were blue, and a pair of blue bracelets, which exactly fitted my wrists, and I walked down the shore, admiring myself. I covered the whole length of the cove. The beads and the bracelets made tinkling sounds. I felt like the bride of a chief as I walked there by the waves. I came to the foot of the trail where the battle had been fought. Suddenly I remembered those who had died there and the men who had brought the jewels I was wearing. I went back to the chest. For a long time I stood beside it, looking at the bracelets and the beads hanging from my neck, so beautiful and bright in the sun. So she's a thinker. She thinks through every decision that she makes. And so she's standing there thinking, should I be wearing this jewelry when all of these people who I loved, including my father, gave their lives over this stupid chest of jewelry and not very many tools or spearheads? So she's thinking, it's inappropriate for me to be wearing this because people died for these silly beads and necklaces. They do not belong to the Aleuts, I said. They belong to me. So she's right about that. They killed the otter, and they paid for the otter that they killed with all of the trinkets. So they do belong to her. But even as I said this, I knew that I could never wear them. One by one, I took them off. I also took the rest of the beads from the chest. Then I walked through the waves and flung them all far away out into the deep water. There were no iron spearheads in the chest. I closed the lid and covered it with sand. I looked along the bottom of the trail, but finding nothing there that I could use, gave up my search. For many days I did not think of the weapons again, not until the wild dogs came one night and sat under the rock and howled. They were gone at daylight, but not far. During the day I could see them slinking through the brush watching me. So they're actually hunting her, right? Just like they hunted her brother and they killed her brother. And she knows that if she doesn't deal with them, they're going to kill her too. I mean, she's probably a little bit bigger than her brother was, but at the same time, if you have enough wild dogs and there's only one of you, you're in big trouble. They're going to circle around you and attack you, and you might not survive. So she's got a big problem that she needs to solve. And the problem is hunting her right now. It's like a horror movie. During the day, I could see them slinking through the brush watching me. That night, they came back to the headland. I had buried what was left of my supper, but they dug it up, snarling and fighting amongst themselves over the scraps. Then they began to pace back and forth at the foot of the rock, sniffing the air, for they could smell my tracks and they knew that I was somewhere near. For a long time I lay on the rock while they trotted around below me. The rock was high and they could not climb it, but I was still fearful. As I lay there, I wondered what would happen to me if I went against the law of our tribe, which forbade the making of weapons by women. If I did not think of it at all and made those things which I must have to protect myself, would the four winds blow in from the four directions of the world and smother me as I made the weapons? Or would the earth tremble, as many said, and bury me beneath its falling rocks? Or, as others said, would the sea rise over the island in a terrible flood? Would the weapons break in my hands at the moment when my life was in danger, which was what my father had said? I thought about these things for 2 days. So she's like feeling nervous about making weapons because everything in her tribe, the rule was women didn't do that. It's wrong. And so she's going to have to be a level 6 person and have her own personal code and not follow the code of the tribe because the tribe's not there anymore. And if she wants to survive, she has to step up and figure out how to make weapons, right? I mean, the dogs are not going to wait for her to have a moral dilemma and to be thinking about what she should do, if it's right or wrong. I thought about these things for 2 days, and on the third night, when the wild dogs returned to the rock, I made up my mind that no matter what befell me, I would make the weapons. In the morning I set about it, though I felt very fearful. I wished to use a sea elephant's tusk for the tip of the spear, because it is hard and of the right shape. There were many of these animals on the shore near my camp, but I lacked a weapon with which to kill one. Our men usually hunted them with a strong net made of bull kelp, which they threw over an animal while it slept. To do this, at least 3 men were needed, and even then the sea elephant often dragged the net into the sea and got away. I used instead the root of a tree, which I shaped into a point and hardened in the fire. This I bound to a long shaft, with the green sinews of a seal I killed with a rock. Sinew is like there's there's like different kinds of sinew, but sinew, it can be like the muscle of an animal that is dried. It can also be like the gut of an animal, like guitar strings and strings like that are made out of cat gut. Now they're probably synthetic, but so she needs something that's kind of like fishing line, and sinew is kind of like that when it's dried, so that she can wrap it around, attach the arrowhead to the spear. But she's never really like seen weapons made. She's kind of seen them made, but she hasn't really watched very carefully because she knew that she was never going to have to make any weapons. Let's see. I used instead the root of a tree, which I shaped into a point and hardened in the fire. This I bound to a long shaft with the green sinews of a seal I killed with a rock. The bow and arrows took more time and caused me great difficulty. I had a bowstring, but wood which could be bent and yet had the proper strength was not easy to find. So you're going to have to find, if you're making a bow and arrow, an arrow, the arrows are small, thin pieces of wood, but the bow is going to have to be almost as tall as her, the piece of wood. And their island doesn't have a lot of wood on it, a lot of trees, and so that's going to be difficult for her to find. I had a bowstring, but wood which could be bent and yet have the proper strength was not easy to find. I searched the ravines for several days before I found it, trees being very scarce on the island of the Blue Dolphins. Wood for the arrows was easier to find, and also the stone for the tips and the feathers for the ends of the shafts. Gathering these things was not the most trouble. I had seen the weapons made, but I knew little about it. I had seen my father sitting in the hut on winter nights, scraping the wood for the shafts, chipping the stones for the tips, and tying the feathers, yet I had watched him and really seen nothing. I had watched, but not with the eye of one who would ever do it. For this reason, I took many days and had many failures before I fashioned a bow and arrows that could be used. Wherever I went now, whether to the shore when I gathered shellfish or to the ravine for water, I carried this weapon in a sling on my back. I practiced with it and also with the spear. The dogs did not come to the camp during the time I was making the weapons, though every night I could hear them howling. Once, after the weapons were made, I saw the leader of the pack, the one with the gray hair and the yellow eyes, watching me from the brush. I had gone to the ravine for water, and he stood on the hill above the spring looking down at me. He stood very quiet, with only his head showing over the top of a cholla bush. He was too far away for me to reach him with an arrow. Wherever I went during the day, I felt secure with my new weapons, and I waited patiently for the time when I could use them against the wild dogs that had killed Ramo. I did not go to the cave where they had their lair, since I was sure they would soon come to the camp. Yet every night I climbed onto the rock to sleep. After the first night I spent there, which was uncomfortable because of the uneven places in the rock, I carried dry seaweed up from the beach and made a bed for myself. It was a pleasant place to stay there on the headland. The stars were bright overhead, and I lay and counted the ones that I knew and gave names to many that I did not know. In the morning the gulls flew out from their nests in the crevices of the cliff. They circled down to the tide pools where they stood first on one leg and then the other, splashing water over themselves and combing their feathers with curved beaks. Then they flew off down the shore to look for food. Beyond the kelp beds, pelicans were already hunting, soaring high over the clear water, diving straight down, if they sighted a fish, to strike the sea with a great splash that I could hear. I also watched the otter hunting in the kelp. These shy little animals had come back soon after the Aleuts had left, and now there seemed to be as many of them as before. The early morning sun shone like gold on their glossy pelts, yet as I lay there on the high rock looking at the stars, I thought about the ship which belonged to the white men, and at dawn as light spread across the sea, my first glance was toward the little harbor of Coral Cove. Every morning I would look for the ship there, thinking that it might have come in the night, and each morning I would see nothing except the birds flying over the sea. When there were people in Galestat, I was always up before the sun and busy with many things, but now that there was little to do, I did not leave the rock until the sun was high. I would eat and then go to the spring and take a bath in the warm water. Afterwards I went down to the shore where I would gather a few abalones and sometimes spear a fish for my supper. Before darkness fell, I climbed onto the rock and watched the sea until it slowly disappeared in the night. The ship did not come, and thus winter passed and the spring. So she's had half a year pass already, and she's been looking for the ship every day. She's been making weapons to protect herself against the wild dogs and just kind of living her life like she's going to be rescued. She's going to be rescued off the island. That's what she's assuming, right? You're going to see that she kind of starts to realize that that's probably not going to happen. She can't count on that. So she's going to have to make her life her own and figure out how to lead her life instead of waiting for something to happen, right? She's going to have to dive in and just start leading her life. All right. we're getting into the awesome part of the story. Sorry about Ramo. I believe in the story, Ramo kind of is a character that leads her back to the island. The real woman that this story is based on did not have a brother. They think that she had a baby and that she went back for her baby, or that she just went back and she didn't have a brother. I think the author probably invented Ramo to get her back onto the island, right? The reason for her being stuck there is because of her brother. All right. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.